What exactly does it mean to be an American? Well, ethnic and national identity is complex, and in the modern day it seems like national cohesion is beginning to erode quite quickly, as American culture seems so fluid, diverse, and widespread that it almost seems too difficult to pinpoint down just what exactly is the typical American. I discussed in a previous video whether there was such a thing as an ethnic American, in the same terms of ethnogenesis as other major ethnic groups like the English, German, Irish, Chinese, or Arabs, and I came to the conclusion that rather than having a single ethnic core like most European countries, or many Asian and African countries, cohesion was maintained more around the traditions and values of American people rather than a shared background. And Americans have always expressed an interest and desire in preserving their own ethnic heritage, but also learning about their fellow countrymen as well. The United States Census Bureau does a pretty good job at not only enumerating the population, but giving an interesting demographic snapshot every decade, with estimates coming out every year for a variety of reasons. But in my opinion, there are a lot of issues with the way they categorize certain populations that really don't make a whole lot of sense, and you have loads of people interpreting this data who really don't know what they're talking about. Census Day this year in the United States is supposed to take place on April 1st, although it's unknown if this will be postponed due to extenuating circumstances, but we already have a pretty good idea on what the end result will look like due to pretty accurate estimations released by the US government every year. Now, I could just go through the results of the census as you will see them line by line, but that just wouldn't make sense, seeing as to how I don't agree with the categories anyways, and I'll explain why. The first question that is asked on the census regards Hispanic and Latino origin. So basically, they categorize the US into two ethnicities, Hispanic and non-Hispanic. Now, I understand just why they do this, wanting to keep track of how many people are coming through from the South and all that, but from a demographic standpoint, does this even make a lick of sense? Not mentioning that this isn't even what ethnicity means, it's a bit ludicrous to classify every single person from Latin America into the same ethnic or racial category, as I'll get into. The next question is regarding race, and they list white, black, Native American, Asian, Pacific Islander, and other, but the Hispanic option effectively overrides the next response for race. So if you identify as a white Hispanic or a black Hispanic, you'd be grouped in the same race. Technically, since the bulk of Hispanics are of mixed European and Native American ancestry, they should be checking off both white and Native American for the second option, but many Hispanics are unsure of their ancestry and hence just check other, and I think it would make much more sense for the census to list mixed Latino as an option for Latin Americans who are mixed but unsure of their heritage, seeing as to how almost all Latin Americans are mixed to a certain extent, only with wide discrepancies between groups. As opposed to 98% of self-identified non-Hispanic white Americans who have 95% European DNA or above, only 6% of all Hispanic Americans have so, with a much flatter distribution of genetic admixture than non-Hispanics, with the mode, or largest clustering, being in the range of 60% European, with around half of all Hispanic Americans having between 50 and 70% European DNA, with only 20% having less than 50. So this means that there are a very large number of Hispanics who cluster very closely with white Americans, and in any other country in the Americas would be seen as white, yet due to the history of the one-drop rule in the United States and the historical desire for racial purity, they are placed together with others from the same cultural grouping despite the huge genetic variation. 2/3 of Hispanic Americans have more than 25% Native American DNA, with the average Hispanic in the US being around 26% Amerindian, 7% African, and 4% Middle Eastern and North African, but there is huge variation within the grouping of Hispanic American. This is especially apparent in Cuban, Puerto Rican, or Argentine Americans, with many being pretty much indistinguishable from your average non-Hispanic white, or many Panamanian, Dominican, or Colombian Americans who are about as close to black as you can be, yet we just see them as Hispanic because why exactly? I understand that, unlike in the United States, race is much more of a spectrum in Latin America and more fluid, with there not really being any hard cutoff between these groups, and it is quite confusing to people. But I believe I was able to do a pretty good job at defining these different groups in a tangible way with my channel census for my audience. The larger than average Middle Eastern and North African component seen throughout all Latin Americans is due to the overrepresentation of Spanish minority groups from Europe to the Americas, namely the Isleños, those from the Canary Islands near North Africa, Gitanos, Spanish Gypsies or Romani, Moriscos, Islamic Moors who converted to Catholicism, but especially the Sephardim or Spanish Jews, who were previously the largest minority population in Spain, but with a huge number emigrating to the New World, they had an inordinate impact on the population. Even when it comes to the European ancestry of Hispanics, it's not entirely Spanish or Castilian in origin, just as many outsiders may assume that all white Americans are of English ancestry, as in many areas of Latin America, Spanish migrants were joined and often outnumbered by other European groups, especially the Basques early on, with Spanish and Basque surnames predominating most Hispanics, although many Italian, German, French, or other Europeans Hispanicized their surnames upon settling in these countries, just as many immigrants Anglicanized their surnames in the U.S. Around 30% of white Americans in the census who specified a European ethnic group identified with more than one. For instance, German Swedish or English Irish. However, the percentage that actually have mixed European heritage is actually believed to be much higher than this, especially for old stock Americans who have been around for several generations. But just as it doesn't make sense to include all Anglicanized whites under the same ethnicity in the United States, it makes even less sense to include all Hispanicized people under the same ethnicity as well, since they have even more genetic and arguably even cultural diversity. What's especially confusing is that even though Spaniards, as in people from Spain, are considered to be Hispanic or Latino in the US, Portuguese and the Basques are not counted as Latino. But just how many white Hispanics are there in the US anyways? Keep in mind that for the last couple censuses, around half of all Hispanic and Latinos identified as white in the census, while the other half identified as mixed, and the percentage that identify as white has actually increased in recent years. But judging from statistics in their home countries, as well as genetic studies, I would say the percentage of white Hispanics is probably 25 to 30% of the Hispanic American community, rather than the 50 to 60% suggested by the census. So this means that even though Hispanic Americans make up around 38% of California's population as of 2020, the percentage that are actually mixed Latinos is probably more like 26 or 28%, with there also being a large number who identify as indigenous or African as well. Also, I believe that Jewish, Middle Eastern, and North African Americans should not be counted as white in the U.S. Census, but rather have their own separate categories, seeing as to how Ashkenazi Jews, who make up the bulk of the community in the U.S., are of ancient Levantine, Italian, and other Mediterranean origin, and culturally are quite distinct from the average white American. But moving on to other categories, another thing I have a major gripe with is the label of Asian in the U.S. Census, since in American English, the term Asian, when referring to someone's heritage, is largely used to denote those from East and Southeast Asia, and technically South Asians, such as Indians and Pakistanis, are on the Asian continent, but in what world do East Asians like the Chinese have the same race, culture, or heritage as a Bangladeshi? Most South Asians are actually more genetically similar to Europeans and Middle Easterners than East Asians, and hence I think the Asian category is pretty lazy. South Asians already number several million in the United States, and in the near future, the region of South Asia is actually going to outpace both East and Southeast Asia combined, so there's no reason why they should be grouped together in the census out of convenience sake, especially when considering the genetic diversity of South Asians already, with it being a bit dubious whether you could even call South Asian a race or not. Even between East and Southeast Asians, there's a pretty obvious and recognizable difference in appearance and culture with some overlap, but you could say the same for Northern and Southern Europeans as well. One thing that has been pointed out to me many times, and something I'm guilty of myself, is the inclusion of all Pacific Islanders under a single banner, as the difference between someone from Papua New Guinea and Hawaii is pretty stark to say the least, as although Polynesians like the Hawaiians do share a moderate degree of Papuan blood, around 25%, they're still far closer in both appearance and genetics to East and Southeast Asians. But this does become more complicated when you take the Micronesians into account, around 40% Papuan, or Melanesians, around 75% Papuan. So it's difficult to say what the cutoff would be, just as with Hispanics. You can't simply place people into one category or the other. The Black or African American category I don't really have a problem with, but I think that they should definitely make a distinction between different Black American groups, such as the unique Gullah culture of the Atlantic or the Louisiana Creoles of Acadiana, as well as give Black Americans their own ethnic identity, seeing as to how they had that stripped away from them during the days of slavery and had to forge a new one borrowing from many different cultures. By the way, the vast majority of African immigrants to the United States do not identify as black foremost, but rather their own ethnic groups back in Africa, much in the same way that a first-generation immigrant from Poland would consider themselves Polish, not just white, and hence I think a distinction should be made between the old stock descendants of African slaves in the US and newer African migrants who have entirely different cultures. So I could have simply told you the results of the US Census for 2020, or estimated results, but as I said, the categories don't make a modicum of sense, and hence I painstakingly calculated my own statistics for what the US really looks like racially speaking, with around 62% being white, 3% Jewish or Middle Eastern, 13% Black or African, 12% Mixed Latino, 4% East or Southeast Asian, 1.6% South Asian, 1.1% Native American, 0.2% Pacific Islander, and 3.6% other multiracial, which, come to think of it, is actually extremely similar to the results of my Masaman channel census. So my channel audience is pretty well representative of the US as a whole, even though they come from all around the world. So to change the perception of how we view race and ethnicity in order to make it more accurate, we first have to change the vernacular that we use and correct people when they use the wrong terminology, which, hey, you guys seem to be pretty good at when it comes to me. So please let me know your thoughts on these different categorizations and whether you agree with my assessments or not. And for today's poll, let me know which US Census category needs the most improvement. And as always, thanks for watching everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.